Welcome to my series, Shit That Happened While I Was a 911 Dispatcher. Here's my most memorable 911 call that I ever took. While I will never forget this call as long as I live, it has been a long time. This call was in either 2004 or 2005, so I may not have all of the details 100% correct, but the gist of it will stick with me for my lifetime. A little backstory. So the technology may have changed, but back then in 2004, 2005, we dispatched off what was called a CAD map. Now, the CAD map had to be manually updated. So as new subdivisions were being built, new addresses were being added, those addresses had to be manually entered by someone in order for them to validate. So if you call in and you say the address you're calling about is 123 Main Street, I manually type in 123 Main Street, but then I validate the address. When I validate the address, it pulls it up, the location on my map. It also tells me where all the other officers are in relation to that because they had automatic vehicle locators in their cars. And it also would tell me the call history that happened at that address. It wasn't uncommon because we were a pretty fast growing city. It wasn't uncommon for an address to not be in the system if it was in a new subdivision or a new development area. I was working a weekend day shift and this lady calls 911 and the address that she gives me does not validate, and I try a couple different ways. She tells me the location of about where it's at, and I went ahead and just put it in at a nearest cross street, and then I manually typed in the address and we dispatched it out over the radio as that address in XYZ subdivision closest to the intersection of blah blah blah, so that everyone would know that it was an unvalidated address in a new subdivision. So we've already got help on the way while I ask her what's going on. She is very upset, and I finally am able to get her to calm down, and she tells me that she has a new baby and the baby has drowned in the bathtub. She says that she only put a little bit of water in the bathtub and she turned around only for a second and she took a short step out into the hallway to get towels, and when she came back in, the baby was face down in the water and the baby was blue. So I followed our protocol. We have these little medical cards. When you have someone with a medical emergency, you ask them XYZ. It says, okay, if they answer this, then you go to this tab. If they answer this, you go to this tab, and you read these instructions. So I'm reading through the cards and I'm getting her to do CPR, or I'm trying to get her to do CPR. I will never forget. I asked her, what is the baby's name? You always try to humanize, right? You ask the caller their name. You call them by name. You ask the victim's name. You humanize. And the baby's name was Jacob. Not uncommon at all for someone to be hysterical when you're trying to give CPR, right? Because that's traumatic. And so I'm giving her the instructions, and something just wasn't right. The pace was not right. Something wasn't right. So I asked her to count the compressions out loud and the breaths. I don't know if we still do, but back then you did compressions and breaths for a newborn. And something just wasn't right. When she started counting, she was like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It just wasn't working. And then the phone disconnected. And then when I tried to call her back, she didn't answer. Not super uncommon because a lot of times people just lose their shit during 911 calls, right? Or I thought maybe the officers had arrived on scene, or maybe the fire department had arrived on scene. So before I tried to call her back again, I checked with the people that were working the radio, and no one had made it on scene yet. Come to find out, everyone had gotten lost because this location was hard to find. The first person that ended up being on scene was the fire chief. He happened to live very close to there. He was out in his civilian vehicle. He had his radio with him. He knew exactly where it was. So the fire chief ended up being the first person on scene. Also not relevant to the story, but we called him Frankie Nine Fingers. So Frankie Nine Fingers shows up on scene first, and he knocks on the door and no one answers. And I'm calling and no one's answering. The story goes that he walks back to his personal vehicle. He's going to retrieve his cell phone and call dispatch and check. And as he's walking back to the car, the woman comes outside and she closes the door behind her, and she's very upset. And he's like, where's the baby? And she's like, the baby is inside. And when he tells this story later, he says that was his first red flag. Why wouldn't she have the baby in her arms? If she knows that she's called for help and someone's knocking on her door, he expected for the mother to greet him with a lifeless baby in her arms to help. So she doesn't let him in the house. She goes and retrieves the baby. The baby, come to find out, is 9 months old, I believe. 6 to 9 months old, I think 9. And she hands the baby to Frankie Nine Fingers, and she leaves and goes back in the house. And he said in his 30 plus years of working in the field, he had never had a mother whose baby was in distress that she just hands over and walks away. He is intubating this baby by himself in the front yard, and the mom leaves. Can you guess where this is going yet? So everyone finally arrives on scene. They do end up transporting baby Jacob after they've already intubated him in the front yard. And although he did survive, he did have a lack of oxygen to his brain for a substantial amount of time, and he ended up brain dead but on life support at the hospital. Luminol in the bathroom, and sure enough, they found blood everywhere when she disconnected the phone, and when she wasn't answering the front door, and when she wouldn't let Frankie Nine Fingers in the house. Apparently she was cleaning up the blood, and what they determined happened was that she aggressively beat him so hard that his rectum tore and he was bleeding out from his rectum. She did end up being convicted, and once the state took full custody of baby Jacob, they made the decision to take him off of life support. Remember when I told you guys that I was going to do this series, I told you that I worked with some really excellent officers and then like 1 to 7 bad apples. The detective who was working this case had a picture of baby Jacob that he had been given by a family member, and he kept that picture on his desk until that case was closed as a reminder of who he was fighting for, and I thought that was really cool, and I'll never forget that detective.